From Manchester, New Hampshire to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. On the brief today, Ryan Teague Beckwith here in New Hampshire on Bernie Sanders' rise and Joe Biden's fall. Michael McKee in New York on Fed Chair Jerome Powell's second day of testimony up on Capitol Hill, and Sophie Cameron in Hong Kong with the latest on the spread of the coronavirus. So, Ryan, welcome. It's good to have you here. Give us a sense of what we learned in New Hampshire last night, and what does it tell us about what comes next?
I think that we learned that Joe Biden was, as we had been saying for a while, the weakest front runner, and to the extent that he is no longer the front runner. I think that Bernie Sanders, Pete Buttigieg are clearly very competitive going forward. Amy Klobuchar had a good night, but it's going to be really difficult for her to catapult herself into the one of the top two slots, given the amount of time that she has.
What did we find out about voter turnout? Because it sounds like it might have been a little better than we thought at first.
So I just checked just before we went on air, and with 97% of precincts reporting, we're at about 295,000. That is above what the New Hampshire Secretary of State had predicted. Even accounting for population growth, it's closer to what you saw like in 2008. So that should be some solace for Democrats who'd been concerned after low turnout in Iowa that there was maybe an enthusiasm gap. One thing to keep in mind is that independent voters can show up in the Democratic primary. So some of those, that may be bolstered a little bit by them. But generally, Democrats like for people to show up and vote for their candidate because it means they're invested for the fall.
So we hear that Joe Biden is have a conference call with his supporters today, which would be interesting to listen in on exactly what his funders are saying.
Interesting to listen in on to just before the conference call.
Exactly. But what about who's best positioned going into South Carolina, Nevada, and ultimately Super Tuesday?
Well, the most interesting thing that happened overnight was that one of the big unions in Nevada put out a flyer. They haven't yet endorsed, but put out a flyer sort of calling some questions about Medicare for All and Bernie Sanders, and even subtly boosting Amy Klobuchar a little bit in the flyer. So that's not quite an endorsement, but that is a sign that a really key voting bloc in Nevada could be up for grabs.
Is that pesky issue of private insurance? As I understand, the culinary workers said, you know what, we like our private insurance.
Yes.
We don't want you to take it away.
Not all of the unions feel that way, but the culinary workers in Nevada have a really gold-plated health care plan that they have fought a long time for, and that's made them not be particular fans of Medicare for All.
Okay, Ryan Teague Beckwith, thank you so much for reporting here from New Hampshire. And now let's go to Michael McKee in New York, as we have a second day of testimony from the chairman of the Fed. What did we learn today that's different from what we learned yesterday, Mike?
Oh, David, that would make for a very short report. Not a whole lot different. A difference in tone, perhaps, from the senators, but not a difference in substance in terms of the questioning from the House yesterday. The senators trying to make political points that their policies of one side or another are better than the others, and a lot of focus, therefore, on unemployment. The way you would describe Jay Powell today is reassuring. He heard the senators. Yes, he agrees that more needs to be done to help people at the lower incomes. And yes, there have been improvements in wages, and there certainly is improvement in the unemployment rate. And the Fed is going to do its best to keep all of that going. There were some questions we didn't get yesterday on regulatory issues, particularly on the repo side. Follow-up, one of the suggestions that Vice Chairman Randall Quarles has suggested is to make it easier for banks to turn in treasuries for repo if they need cash. The chairman seemed to endorse that idea, which would be big news for the banking system if they go ahead and do that. It may be done as part of the discount window, or it may be done as a new standing repo facility. But if you're going to look at anything that might affect the industry, that might be the answer you were looking at today. The rest, as Will Rogers once said, is all applesauce.
And Michael, it struck me that one thing that was common in the 2 days is the Fed chair basically saying we can't do it all. Some of these issues require other people to step up. For example, today I was interested in labor force participation rates and the comparison with other countries, and his saying, you know what, we've fallen behind a lot of other countries in our education rates. Somebody's got to do something to educate our workers if we want to catch up fully in the labor sector.
That's been a theme of his throughout the 2 days of testimony, that there's a lot that the government can do to improve potential growth in the United States, raising the labor force and raising productivity, and that would require additional spending on things like education, on things like infrastructure, and that's not the Fed's job, that's members of Congress' job. Whether they were listening, that's a different question.
Yeah, that is a different question. Okay, thank you so much to Michael McKee, reporting from New York. And now we go to Sophie Cameron, our colleague over in Hong Kong, about the spread of the coronavirus. Give us an update right now. Is it leveling off, the growth of the coronavirus, Sophie?
Well, based on the numbers that we're seeing officially from the province of Hubei, that would seem to be the case, with that number of reported cases declining. But there is some doubt being cast over the transparency of Chinese data. And in a commentary published in the Lancet Medical Journal, we do have a piece there indicating that preliminary genetic sequencing data was made available 2 weeks before the public release. And while we have the world watching as to what China may do, we have the U.S. Senate looking to have a briefing on Wednesday morning Eastern time with representatives from the CDC and the FDA and among the federal agencies to be present. And the House Energy and Commerce Committee will be holding a hearing with the U.S. Health Secretary at the end of this month, David.
Yeah, and Sophie, whether or not the cases are growing more slowly than before, the effects continue to ripple through. I mean, there are a lot of events being canceled. For example, I'm particularly focused on the Grand Prix, but other people are focused on other things. What is being canceled over there at this point?
Yeah, the Chinese Grand Prix, that has been postponed. It was to be scheduled for April, and there's potential for the Hong Kong Rugby Sevens, a mega event for the city, to be confirmed, officially postponed by tomorrow. We're also seeing concerns around the Mobile World Congress in Barcelona, whether or not that will be canceled as well. So a lot of consternation to be had there. And as he pointed out, there's still a lot of impact across the economy on the mainland and elsewhere. We're seeing many Chinese cities remain ghost towns as shoppers remain at home. And we're seeing factories, several of them still taking time to come online, David.
Okay, Sophie, thank you for all your great reporting from Hong Kong. That's our colleague Sophie Camerudin over in Hong Kong. And now it's time for a check on how the markets are reacting to today's top stories. Joining us now is Abigail Doolittle. So I'm going to go out on a limb here. It doesn't look like the markets are very worried about Bernie Sanders, Abigail.
Well, that is absolutely correct. That is definitely one of the stories that we're following today, because take a look at the gains for the major averages here in the U.S. The S&P 500 and the Dow up for a third day in a row, hitting new all-time highs. We also have oil higher, bonds lower. Relative to Bernie Sanders, there is a storyline out there that so long as he is leading the field of Democratic candidates, that's good news for President Trump, who has been good news for the stock market. So investors not all that worried. But you could also talk about the coronavirus and the idea that perhaps it has peaked and the impact on the global economy is not going to be as severe as had been thought last week, certainly when there were declines, or excuse me, the week before that. So at this point, a risk-on picture. That's true, too, when we use the Bloomberg IMAP to take a look at what's happening sector-wise, because right now, 10 of the 11 sectors are higher. Only consumer staples is down fractionally. Up top, consumer discretionary up 1%, energy up 1%, being helped out by that oil rising. And then healthcare there, David, up just fractionally, up about 0.1%, but returning to Bernie Sanders after he has, of course, won the New Hampshire primary. We have big gains for a subsector, managed care. Take a look at all these managed care companies up in a big way, because, of course, Bernie Sanders is a proponent of Medicare for all. The idea that many investors and traders out there think he's unlikely to beat President Trump would be good news for these managed care companies. So we're seeing big gains there on the day, David.
Yeah, the markets are taking it all in stride, I dare say. Okay, thanks so much to Abigail Doolittle for that update on the markets. And now we go to Mark Crumpton in New York for Bloomberg First Word News. Mark?
David, thank you. As we have been reporting, Bernie Sanders has tightened his grip on the Democratic Party's liberal wing. He turned back challenges by two moderate contenders to win the New Hampshire primary. Sanders received about 26% of the vote. South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg was a close second, followed by Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar. Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren and former Vice President Joe Biden finished well behind in single digits. The cruise ship that was barred from docking in 4 countries has found a place to disembark the more than 2,200 people on board. Operators of the Westerdam say the vessel will dock in Cambodia on Thursday. The ship was turned away by Thailand, Taiwan, Japan, and the Philippines because of fears that those aboard could spread a virus that originated in China. Holland America Line says there are no confirmed cases on board the ship. Turkish President Recep Erdogan is vowing to drive Russian-backed Syrian government forces from the last rebel stronghold of Idlib. Erdogan is escalating his threats against Damascus after being strengthened by rare public support from the United States. Today, Erdogan threatened to hit Syrian targets, quote, anywhere if Turkish troops are harmed again. At least 13 Turkish soldiers have been killed by Syrian artillery fire this month. Air pollution from burning fossil fuels is costing the world $8 billion a day. That's according to Greenpeace. The group says that's about 3.3% of global gross domestic product, about $2.9 trillion per year. Greenpeace says China, the United States, and India are the biggest polluters. The report estimates that fossil fuel pollution causes up to 4.5 million premature deaths each year. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Coming up here, the New Hampshire results are in. We asked the former head of the New Hampshire Democratic Party what we learned from last night. That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston here in Manchester, New Hampshire. Senator Bernie Sanders edged out Pete Buttigieg here in New Hampshire last night. The top two finishers were the same as in Iowa, but this time, fortunately, unlike the caucuses, we actually got timely results. We welcome now the former head of the New Hampshire Democratic Party. She is Kathy Sullivan. Kathy now serves on the as a Democratic National Committee woman. Also back with us are our contributors, Jeannie Zaino, political science professor at Iona College, and Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital. Rick is a veteran of many political campaigns, including 2 successful runs here in New Hampshire for John McCain. So, Kathy, first of all, I guess congratulations. Hey, you got a result.
Yes, we did.
Thank you.
We're very happy about that, and the results started coming in even earlier than I anticipated.
It also, I'm told, but there's a Bloomberg report on this, it's the closest primary, I think, in New Hampshire history. I mean, it is true that Bernie Sanders came in one, but Pete Buttigieg was very close. Very close,
and also Senator Sanders has, I think, either the smallest margin or almost the smallest margin of any winner in New Hampshire primary history.
Wow, that's really telling about the competitiveness. But let's talk a little bit about the turnout, because earlier everyone was speculating, after Iowa it was a little flat. The turnout for the caucuses, what would it be like in New Hampshire with a primary? Looks like you're just under 300,000 voters. That's a pretty good turnout.
We are so excited with the turnout that we had. It was really, really high, and just shows the enthusiasm of New Hampshire voters generally. It showed the enthusiasm particularly of our Democratic voters and of those independents who came to vote on the Democratic side. And I think it showed why New Hampshire is the first primary, because our voters are engaged. They finally made their minds up. They came out and
they wait late.
They waited late, but they finally did.
I actually thought it was because it was required by law.
Withhold your support until the last day.
Exactly.
I think the biggest surprise of the night for me was Amy Klobuchar, and how, speaking of these late deciders, she seemed to get the benefit of that, as did Pete Buttigieg to a certain extent. What do you think explains that? We're hearing a lot that New Hampshireites are saying that the debate actually mattered an awful lot in their decision. Is that what you're hearing?
That's what I'm hearing, too. The debate really made a difference, because as people are making their minds up, they tend to think of what is the last big thing I heard or what I saw about the candidates, and that debate was the last thing a lot of people saw, and that's what they remembered as they walked in to vote. And those debates are always big in New Hampshire. I remember in 2008, it was big for Hillary Clinton. And so here we come again, that we have another big moment at a debate, and it really did matter.
You have a role as well for the DNC overall,
yes,
for the national campaign. Are you at all concerned about this apparent rift between the moderates and the progressives? I mean, that seems to be the storyline today. Bernie Sanders has got the mantle for the progressives, and the moderates are split. Does that give you any pause?
Not really. I think that as we go along, things will continue to clarify. And what we have is just a very good group of candidates, very competitive. The next round of states are going to have their say, too, as we continue on. And I think it's great that we have a lot of very good candidates who have stepped forward. And look what happened with the Republicans in the last election. They had a lot of candidates. It went on, and people talked about a split in the Republican Party. And look, we ended up with Donald Trump as president. And so if history means anything, I think this could be good for the Democrats.
Well, the narrative for the last year has been all the energies on Bernie Sanders' side and Elizabeth Warren's side. Look at how the energized left has taken over this whole process. But last night told us a completely different story. I mean, Bernie Sanders barely held his border counties. Pete Buttigieg cut into that.
Yes.
He also cut into Elizabeth Warren's counties along the Massachusetts border. Used to be strongholds for both of them in the early polling. And together, the moderates clearly outvoted the progressive left. So do you see a rise now in the narrative that it's the moderates who really are taking control of this process?
Well, first of all, I think the split is sometimes a little bit emphasized too much, because I do believe that for most Democrats, we have the same fundamental philosophies about equal justice, social justice, racial justice, equal economic opportunity, health care, climate change.
But on health care, Kathy, big debate going on right now. Pete Buttigieg made it a central point last night in his victory speech, or his speech, whatever you call it, and Bernie shot right back. I mean, the two of them do not see eye to eye on health care.
Well, but we do agree on one thing, and that is that everyone should have access to good health care. And where we differ,
there's always some common ground.
Right. And so we differ on the details, but we have a lot more in common than we have driving us apart. And so no matter who our nominee is as we go forward, I think the party will come together. Will there be some supporters of some candidates who drop off, and that does happen. But I think by the time we get to the end, whoever our nominee is going to be able to draw in enough independents and enough Republican support to offset anybody who may feel that their candidate has been left out.
And I know that you're a supporter, you have been a supporter of Elizabeth Warren, and we just heard when we were coming on that another neighboring politician, Deval Patrick, has suspended his campaign. Are you seeing anything in the horizon in terms of Elizabeth Warren, Vice President Biden, any more winnowing you're seeing on the horizon given their performance in New Hampshire last night, which was obviously problematic for both of them?
Well, with respect to Senator Warren, I know she has a national campaign going. She's got 1,000 people on the ground across the country. I always like to use the analogy. Remember the New England Patriots down 28-3. You make some adjustments, you come back, and the fight is on. And so I think Elizabeth Warren, she persists. I think we're going to see that.
But if she goes 4 and out, right? I mean, she's going to play obviously in Nevada, and the caucuses may be better for her. South Carolina, not sure what kind of a match that is for a New England liberal, in the party. What happens when she gets to Super Tuesday and she hasn't either garnered any real delegate count or hasn't actually placed in the top 2?
Remember, when Super Tuesday is 3 days after South Carolina, a lot of states either have started voting or they will be voting in the next couple of weeks.
California's already started last week.
Exactly. Yep. And so I think everyone stays into Super Tuesday. There's no reason not to. And I think you're going to see Elizabeth Warren, do much better. And as I said, she persists. So I'm looking forward to it.
In November, we're not just going to elect a president. We're going to elect 435 representatives. We're going to have a third of the Senate. From your position on the DNC, what do you need in a presidential candidate to help those candidates? And specifically, let's talk about the people who are first-year people who come from Trump-leaning districts.
Obviously, we need someone who's going to be able to reach out and inspire voters, who is able to capitalize on the anxiety and the feelings that people have in this country right now about Donald Trump, but to also present a compelling alternative vision. And that's what we need so that our congressional candidates, our governors, our senatorial candidates, like here in New Hampshire, have a ticket that they can be a part of and just move forward together as a unit. It's going to be very important for us to have a unified party when we get to November.
This November thing's a good question. We have this new phenomenon named Mike Bloomberg entering the Democratic primary in a couple of weeks in the Super Tuesday states. But today, he's opening up an operation here in New Hampshire, assuming he's going to be the nominee, I suppose. But he is ready to go to battle against Donald Trump in New Hampshire today, as he's done in 8 other targeted states. Sounds like New Hampshire going to get back in that targeted zone. What do you need to see happen here in the interim? While everyone else is focused on picking the next nominee, what's going to happen in New Hampshire to make it a winning state for Democrats?
Well, I have to say thank you, Michael Bloomberg, that you're coming in here with 14 staff members. He's got some really good people that he's hired to run this effort.
And a lot of people unemployed as of today.
Exactly. And Ryan Mahoney, state director for this effort. He's chief of staff for the mayor, worked in the state legislature. Really good people, and their job over the next few months is going to be to build a compelling case against Donald Trump, talk to Democrats about our issues, and talk to independents and those moderate Republicans who are looking for an alternative. So this is nothing but good for our party to have, in addition to our state party, another organization here helping us. And so I'm really excited about this.
Okay, Kathy, thank you so much for coming back with us. Really appreciate it. That's Kathy Sullivan. She's former chair of the New Hampshire Democratic Party. We want to remind you that Michael R. Bloomberg is the founder and founder majority owner of Bloomberg LP. That's our parent company. Rick and Jeannie will be staying with us. And still ahead here, an exclusive interview with BP CEO Bernard Looney live from London. We're going to discuss how his company is weathering the global slump in oil prices. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston in Manchester, New Hampshire. Our stock of the hour is PVH, the owner of brands like Tommy Hilfiger and Calvin Klein. The apparel maker is the latest manufacturer to warn that the coronavirus may impact its operations. Joining us from New York is Abigail Doolittle May, but last time I checked, the stock was actually up, isn't it, Abigail?
It is indeed. It's popping in quite a nice way, David. And that has everything to do with the fact that even though the coronavirus is impacting their operations, they've actually been able to reaffirm the full year view. So investors are liking that quite a bit. And behind the ability to reaffirm the full year view, they also own, of course, as you were mentioning, not just Tommy Hilfiger, but Calvin Klein. They have lots of stores in China. Most are closed. At those stores that are open, they have very low traffic. And Greater China was about 7% of their revenue in 2019, 16% of sales in Asia Pacific, 20% of the company's goods are made in China. So they have quite a amount of exposure to China. So the fact that they're able to keep the view that they had ahead of this tragedy, David, is seen as good news. So those shares are popping higher.
So how are they weathering the coronavirus downturn, I guess to say? Is it thought that it just is not going to last that long?
Well, you know, David, it's not entirely clear. They didn't give that sort of detail. This is just a mid-quarter update. They will be reporting later in March. And the CEO did really stress the idea that while this is a near-term issue around China, long-term, they expect China to be a real growth driver for them. We'll have more details on the true impact in March, but right now able to keep the full year view, David.
Okay, Abigail, thank you so much. Abigail Doolittle. Next up, a big interview. BP CEO Bernard Looney joins us for an exclusive interview. That's coming up on Bloomberg. From Manchester, New Hampshire, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to New York and Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. OPEC is feeling the pain from the coronavirus. The cartel has slashed forecasts for global oil demand. The outbreak has severely curbed fuel use in China, and that leaves OPEC facing a renewed glut despite recent production cuts. It reduced projections for demand growth in the first quarter by about a third. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is criticizing the UK's extradition treaty with the United States as, quote, imbalanced. The Prime Minister says his government continues to demand the return of an American diplomat's wife who fled the country following a fatal car crash last August. UK politicians have long complained about the extradition treaty with the U.S., which came into force under Tony Blair's Labour government in 2007. Pope Francis isn't saying whether he'll approve the ordination of married men to address a shortage of priests in the Amazon. In a document released today, the pontiff sidestepped the issue that has dominated debate in the Catholic Church recently. Instead, Francis urged bishops to send missionaries to the Amazon, where Catholics in remote areas can go for months or even years without Mass. Former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick has dropped his bid for the White House. Patrick entered the Democratic race just 3 months ago. He's ending his campaign after failing to secure 1% of the vote in the New Hampshire primary. Patrick was the last black presidential candidate in the contest for the Democratic nomination. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David, back to you in Manchester.
Thank you so much, Mark. Oil has had a rough start to 2020 with Brent crude tumbling about 15% as fears of the coronavirus hit global demand. Our colleague, Alex Steele, she's the anchor of Bloomberg Daybreak Americas, is in London for an exclusive interview with one of the leaders in the energy sector, the new CEO of BP. Alex?
Thank you so much, David. I appreciate it. That's right. I'm here with Bernard Looney, the new CEO of BP, just a week into the job, and unveiled a huge plan for the company over the next 30 years, which we will get to. Bernard, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Alex.
I do want to ask you, though, news of day and sort of what's happening in the oil market right now. Have you noticed, or what kind of demand drop-off have you noticed from the coronavirus in China? How do you see all that playing out on the global stage?
Very good. Well, you know, the first thing I think is the coronavirus is obviously a human tragedy. I think over 1,000 people have died now. We've got a very large business in Asia. We've thankfully accounted for all of our people. Nobody's been infected, but it is a human tragedy, and our thoughts go to the people that are impacted. Beyond that, into the marketplace, I think the question, of course, on everybody's mind is just how long this will last. Our CFO last week, I think, said that the impact could be in the region of 300,000 to 500,000 barrels a day. So I think time will tell as to how this plays out. First of all, it's a tragedy, and secondly, the question is duration, and that will ultimately determine the impact on GDP worldwide and on supplies.
So obviously the question in the market has been, will OPEC Plus come in and help and have some kind of big supply cut? What's your forecast into the ability of OPEC to manage the market and support prices at 50, which in essence is what you need for your climate plan going forward?
Yeah, I think, you know, a lot of people spend a lot of time trying to debate what might happen and what will happen and what's going to happen to price. And
that's why I have a job.
It's something that I don't try to spend a huge amount of time on, to be honest, because the reality is, and the coronavirus is a great example, we just don't know what the future holds. We don't control the price. What we do control is our cost base. What we do control is our break even. And that's what we're focused on very, very much. BP is very fortunate to be in a place where we're coming into a period of time where we have a lot of projects coming online, 35 projects between 2016 and 2021, 23 already online, 12 more to go. We're entering a period where we will have excess free cash flows, and what that means, as you well know, is that our break-even will continue to go down over the coming years. So that's what I'm very focused on, is making sure that we build an increasingly resilient business, because for all the reasons that we have talked about at the beginning, the future is unpredictable. We do control our cost base, and that's what we're focused on.
So Shell got really hurt in its last earnings. They really modeled their plan on $65 oil and staying there and rising. It didn't get there, and it's not rising from there either. What did you model your next sort of 30-year outlook that you unveiled today? What oil price does that depend on?
Well, again, anybody that's trying to predict the price of oil next week or next month, let alone in 30 years, I think is on a bit of a fool's errand.
But you need to run your models for cash flow.
What I will tell you is what we are doing. And over the next couple of years, in fact, in 2021, we will drive the break-even of the business down to $40. We believe that that's a very resilient price that enables us to withstand a variety of environments. So we run all sorts of scenarios, as you say. We run $60, $70 scenarios. We run $50 scenarios. We may run higher scenarios. Nobody quite knows what the future does look like. What we are trying to test is how does it look in a range of scenarios and how resilient is the portfolio.
And all of this ties into the plan that you unveiled. And what you drove home very hard when we did our Q&A was that it's a gearing, it's dividend, and it's the energy transition. The three things that shareholders want and the three things that you're committed to. There is just a lot of skepticism among investors that you can do all three at the same time.
I understand. And I think we have been listening to our shareholders. And as I said earlier, people want us to get our gearing back into range, which we can and will do. People want to know that the dividend is protected and is secure. And people want us to invest in and partake in the energy transition. Now, depending on what investor you're talking to and depending where you are in the world, the order of those priorities may change. The question for us is, can we deliver all three? And I fundamentally believe that we can. I think there is a sense out there that investing in the energy transition is somehow adding more and more and more capital to the system. What I said earlier today is that we are absolutely committed to capital discipline. Our current range is $15 to $17 billion. I made it very clear that we do not need to see that number rise, and that when we come back with our strategic update in September, that will be the capital guidance for the company in the years ahead. The question is the allocation of capital. And what I also said is that over time, you can expect BP to invest more and more into low to no carbon businesses. And at the same time, you can expect investment into oil and gas to come down over time. Now, what that is not, Alex, is a blank check to just go and spend money. We've been very clear, and I think you heard me say it today, that we will only invest into new businesses if A, we can generate scale, B, we can actually add something as BP, so otherwise an investor can go and buy a particular stock on their own, and C, we can generate a competitive return. So that is the framework. It is not a question of how much money are you going to spend, it is the quality of that opportunity.
Does all of that imply, though, a long-term bearish view on oil?
I think the future for any commodity, and oil is no exception, is a great question. I don't know. And people have tried over many, many years to predict the future of the price of our product. And I think they have invariably got it wrong. What we do know is that oil and gas will be needed by society for decades to come. Look at any scenario. Don't just look at the BP Energy Outlook. Look at the IPCC reports. Look at any report, the IEA that's out there. Hydrocarbons will exist in the system for decades to come. The question is how do we decarbonize them over time? So oil and gas is going to be around. Gas in particular is a great fuel which will help and enable the transition. But over time, they have to be decarbonized, and that is the agenda that we set out today.
Because the reason why what I'm trying to get at, too, is that if you walk forward, say, 20 years, and all of a sudden we have a super cycle in oil and we have Brent at 150 again, aren't shareholders going to want to go to, say, Exxon, that's done less in this area, that's more, say, pure oil, than BP, which is then diversified and has more alternative energy? Then you're not really going to get that same boost from your stock in that way. How do you think about that?
I think about that the following way. I think today there is a concentration of oil and gas in our portfolio. I do believe that over time our shareholders will be well served by a diversified BP, a BP that has a very high quality oil and gas business, an oil and gas business that over time is likely to get smaller, and an oil and gas business that over time is likely to be decarbonized. And at the same time, I see us building and growing new low or zero carbon businesses that we can add unique value to. So let's take wind. If we have the wind business today, it's a very competitive market. The question is can BP add something to a wind business, an offshore wind business? Well, I believe maybe we can, with gas balancing that wind power, with a trading platform. We have one of the world's largest trading enterprises trading around that, and a digital platform on which all of this is based. That's the sort of opportunity that I believe we can play in. So it is this concept of, over time, a smaller oil and gas business that is decarbonized and growing a new low to zero carbon business.
So I have to try and break news here. Does that mean that you're going to sell oil and buy wind assets?
What that means is that we will come back to the market in probably September with the next installment in what the next stage of the journey looks like. Today, and I made it very clear, I think, in the talk that we just had, we are setting out a direction of travel. Every journey, including the one we make in our car, first thing we do is we dial in the destination into the sat-nav. That says where we're headed. Today, we laid out a destination for BP. We said that by 2050, we will be a net zero company, not just on our operational emissions, but on the carbon content of our upstream production. This is a significant move. And secondly, we said we would work very hard to help the world get to net zero. Now, the devil is in the detail, clearly. And we have work to do to fill in that detail. But we do have a direction. It has been set. It is, I think, quite different. And we will come back to the marketplace in September with an update.
So if you sell some oil assets and then someone else develops them, how is that going to help the world?
Well, I think
you have to just sit on them and just write them off altogether?
I think it is a question that people ask, and many of my peers and ourselves over time have been selling and buying oil and gas assets. Now, the question is, does that help the world? And that's where I take today. We said we had 5 aims to get to net zero as BP, 5 aims to help the world get to net zero. In terms of the 5 aims to help the world get to net zero, we're doing a lot of work in that space. Today we talked about advocacy, we talked about corporate advertising, we talked about remuneration of our employees. We talked about a lot in that space. And the second thing I would say is that if we take some of the proceeds from any such disposals, and I'm not announcing any new disposals today, we already have announced a $15 billion divestment program. If there are any proceeds from that, some of that can be used to invest into new technologies.
How does all of this square with your 20% stake in Rosneft?
So we have been in Russia for over 30 years. We have a long, deep strategic relationship with Rosneft. Rosneft is doing a lot in this space, probably more than many people might imagine. I would just encourage people to look at some data. Rosneft, for example, published its first sustainability report in 2006. It has improved each and every year since then. I would encourage people to look at their most recent, where they put the UN Sustainable Development Goals at the core of what they talk about. They are, because of scale, actually on a carbon intensity better than BP on some measures and some of our industry peers. They have driven methane intensity down by 48% in 2018. They have established a subcommittee focused on carbon and sustainability. And just recently, an executive from BP has been seconded into Rosneft at their request to focus on carbon. So this is a company that is very focused on this issue. We all start from different starting points, but their direction of travel is clear when it comes to what they want to do with their environmental performance.
So I'm sure you've had conversations with Igor, who runs Rosneft. What are they? What does he say when you tell him about your plan? Is he like, I'm totally on board with you, Bernard, yes, let's do it? Or is it reticence? Can you give me some specifics about those conversations?
As I say, and I think I've made it very, very clear, that this is a company who is very focused on this agenda. We, as BP, are very focused on this agenda. We may have different starting points, but the direction of travel is clear. And I think there is as much for us to learn as there is for Rosneft to learn.
All right, Bernard, thank you very much. I really appreciate you spending your first interview on TV with us. David, I'll send it back to you in New Hampshire.
Great interview. Thank you so much to Alex Steele. She is the anchor of Bloomberg Daybreak America. She's over in London right now. Coming up here in New Hampshire, the Democratic field for president sure looks a lot different from the way it did a couple of months ago. We're going to be joined by a senior political strategist. He's Scott Ferson of Liberty Square on what the New Hampshire primary has done to the race. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston in Manchester, New Hampshire. Well, the New Hampshire primaries may have had some surprises for some people yesterday, but not for the Republican governor, who predicted to us at least some of what happened. This is what he said.
A lot of folks wait till the last couple of days to make up their mind. That's why a lot of things can change. I think that's going to give Amy Klobuchar, I think, a lot of opportunity to surge and unfortunately not be so great for folks like Elizabeth Warren or Joe Biden.
Here to interpret what happened yesterday is Scott Ferson. He is Liberty Square Group President and former press secretary for Senator Ted Kennedy. And, of course, our political contributors are here. Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital and Jeannie Zaino of Iona College. So welcome. Great to have you here.
Oh,
so you heard the governor there. He said it looks like it might be good for Amy Klobuchar, maybe not so much for Elizabeth Warren or Joe Biden. So that was pretty prescient. Did you expect it?
I did. I mean, you could get the sense when you're up in New Hampshire last week that something was moving for Amy Klobuchar. I mean, any conversation I had with people, and you'd sort of mention her name, people would invariably say, oh, I like her. You know, I like her a lot. And Elizabeth Warren, I mean, I think, frankly, it's kind of devastating for Elizabeth Warren. You know, a year ago, you know, if you didn't get the sense that she needed to win in New Hampshire, neighboring state. The last person from Massachusetts not to win was my old boss, Ted Kennedy, in 1980. People in New Hampshire have been very kind to people from Massachusetts, and I think I'm not sure how she recovers from this at a time when Amy Klobuchar is sort of capturing that moderate wing of the party and moving forward.
Yeah, but deconstruct a little bit the Biden phenomena here, right? I mean, he declared early in his campaign he was competing heavy in Iowa, heavy in New Hampshire. He was up in the polls. He spent, a month and a half in Iowa on the No Malarkey tour. He put TV money up in New Hampshire, but not enough to even make an impact. I mean, I think he spent a little over $300,000 here, and kind of phoned in the debate and then left early. I mean, is that any way for someone who's saying, hey, my entire premise for being in this race is my electability?
I mean, you kind of have sympathy for this tremendous amount of goodwill for the former vice president. Very, very well liked in the Democratic Party, but you have to give a reason why you're running, I think. And based on your resume and what you've done, I think isn't quite enough. When you've got Bernie Sanders, who the interesting thing about Bernie Sanders is he hasn't really changed for the times. He's exactly the same person he was 40 years ago. But then you've got Amy Klobuchar, who really just hit her stride and was really making a connection with people. The "I know you" or that phrase really made a connection in a way that Biden was not able to. And I think he collapsed, and I think she was the benefit from it.
So, and you just mentioned Bernie Sanders, and I think one of the things that surprised me was that 75% of voters turned out and voted against, or they voted not against him necessarily, but for somebody else. And 60% of people chose in that moderate lane: Amy Klobuchar, Pete Buttigieg, Joe Biden. So, what do you say to Democrats who are sort of struggling with this, electability issue, and who feel that there is this tension in the party between these progressives and these moderates, and the moderates seem to have the numbers on their side, at least in New Hampshire?
Yeah, although I think if you say that, it makes the Bernie supporters' heads explode.
Yeah, very angry. I don't want to anger them.
Yeah, you do. And even at the party dinner on Saturday night, when Pete Buttigieg spoke, the Bernie Sanders people were booing him.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but you're right. I mean, we have to, I think, recognize as Democrats that this is where our electorate is. Half this vote yesterday was independents. They tend to be more moderate. They're going to be voting and deciding the election in November. And I think we have to, even if it ends up being Bernie Sanders in a multi-candidate field, we have to appeal, our message has to appeal to more moderate voters.
Is the bigger problem for the Democratic Party potentially Bernie Sanders as the candidate or Bernie Sanders as not the candidate? And by that, what I mean is the booing example is a good example. They may just stay home. It's not clear that they'll rally around another candidate from the Democratic Party.
I think you've hit exactly on it. I mean, frankly, I think it's a lose-lose proposition for the Democrats with Bernie Sanders. If he gets the nomination, he alienates the 75% or portion of it, and if he doesn't, already he's won the first two contests, and already they're crying foul almost, and he's won two, so they're sort of girding up for that kind of a fight.
Well, party discipline's everything. I mean, Republicans nominated Donald Trump in a multi-candidate field that pressed out the primary way into May and allowed Trump to vector off of other candidates like Kasich and Cruz to be able to win primaries well below 50% and become the nominee. That's got to be the concern everybody has about Bernie. So do you think there's enough juice in the party leadership or I would say sensitivity in the candidates themselves to realize that splitting up that vote that you described as being widely distributed on the moderate side is bad for the party and ultimately bad for the presidential campaign?
Right. I mean, first, I think there's no juice in the Democratic Party leadership. I don't even know who that might be. I don't think it's Tom Perez. But I think, in the same way that I think Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders in 2016 were two sides of the same coin,
right,
in a lot of respects. And I think now maybe the election is different. Trump is in there. Do we, maybe the time is sort of past Bernie Sanders by nationally for this, not in the primaries, not in the way that these things skew activist and progressive, but more in the general election. So it could be that his time was 4 years ago.
Okay, many thanks to Scott Ferguson, Liberty Square Group President, Democratic Party strategist, and we're going to be having more with Scott Ferguson coming up at 1 p.m. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. We'll get some final thoughts now from Jeannie Zaino and Rick Davis. Jeannie, you go first. Next 7 days, predict one thing that's going to happen in this race.
I think the gloves are going to come off between Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar as they vie for that moderate lane, those two leaders.
Oh, that's interesting. You would like that, Rick. You like the gloves coming off.
I like gloves coming off. I doubt it's going to happen, though.
Oh, come on.
Mike Bloomberg spends another $100 million on the air in 14 states, and he rises up to second in the national polls next to Bernie Sanders, and it starts to look like a two-person race.
So Bloomberg founded our company, and he's majority owner, just to remind everybody one more time, but he's already moved to New Hampshire, as Rick has pointed out. Okay, many thanks now to our Bloomberg contributors, Rick Davis and Jeannie Zaino. They've been with us throughout. It's been a treat being with them. Coming up, they're going to stay with us, actually, for our second hour. We're going to have Balance of Power continuing over on Bloomberg Radio. We're going to talk to Bill Weld. He got about 9% of the vote in the Republican primary, which doesn't sound like that much, but it actually, I think, is more than Joe Biden got, the former vice president. This is Bloomberg Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio.